The walkout by doctors in training continues, with signs of a broader collective action as the medical sector and the government fail to bridge the gap over differences in healthcare expansion plans. So what is the latest in the standoff? Meanwhile, on the security front, what has been North Korea's response to South Korea's latest joint military exercise with the US? And what are the prospects of tackling the comfort women issue based on human rights violation? Hello and welcome. You're watching Issues and Insiders for this Tuesday, and today we have our panel of foreign journalists and their take on some of the latest stories here in this part of the world. For this, I have Andres Sanchez Braun here in the studio. Andres, welcome back.
Hello, thanks for having us here.
I have Jack Barton with us as well. Jack, it's good to have you here.
It's great to be back.
Right, Andres, I believe last week when we were speaking, you spoke about a possible attendance at the press conference to be held by the doctors that took place, I believe, last Tuesday. Tell us about that.
Well, as we all know, it's been 3 weeks already. Around 93% of trainee doctors in Korea have walked out in protest for the government's plan to increase the quotas in medical schools. This is affecting especially big hospitals in the Seoul area where these trainee doctors account for around 40% of the staff. This means, pushing back, canceling surgeries, sending ER room patients to smaller hospitals. This means that many of these patients might take hours, to receive treatment, etc., etc. The government, of course, has sent notifications to them telling them, like, look, we've started administrative procedures. You might lose your license. What's happening here? The doctors are not backing off. We're hearing, right? The government is stating that more doctors are needed in Korea. We do know by OECD standards that Korea has has a small number of doctors, one of the smallest, per 1,000 inhabitants. What are the doctors saying? What did the doctors say in this press conference, in this event? Now, these people were all attached to the KMA, to the Korea Medical Association, but they insisted, they underlined that we are not spokespeople of any kind, but, we want to give you an idea of the kind of conversations we're having and what our demands are. So they were, for example, of course, saying, first place was, they were saying that the government has a political motivation, an agenda behind the timing of this decision. They did it right before the April election. And then they were also saying, for example, they were calling for more investment, both public and private, in hospitals. They were saying that they lack legal protection or enough legal protection. And this is something that the government has actually said, we are actually going to legislate and give you more protection because, yes, you are, especially in certain areas, you're systematically sued, apparently, right? But one thing that I think stood out was they were talking, for example, about what they consider to be a very low fee for service. This is the system that that National Health Insurance, for example, uses to calculate how much a doctor should be paid for, say, a basic service. In this case, for example, a consultation, right? So they were saying this is mostly the reason why, when people say in Korea, well, you're lucky if you get to see your doctor, even if it's your specialist, for 5 minutes in Korea. And then, it's the next patient. They said, well, the reason we have to do this is because if we don't do it, our fees are so low that we don't make enough money. Then again, if you increase the quota of doctors, if you increase the number of doctors, there's more doctors to tend for people. That would potentially mean that there's less money for doctors to be, right? For them to earn. Anyways, some of their demands seem legitimate. I do agree. But I think there's a lack of good communication. They acknowledge this too. If you want to have, especially the public on your side, I think it's important for you to remind people how important your patients are. And this is not something that me or other people that I've spoke to, then again, I'm not an expert, of course, but this is something that we haven't seen. Good news is the minister, Jong-un, the Minister of Health, had a first meeting yesterday, the first meeting since the strike started, a first meeting, and he says that there will be further meetings. So this is a good sign, because I think the only way to break this situation is obviously through talks, and hopefully we will see some progress in the coming days.
Right, some constructive negotiations between authorities, government authorities that is, and the medical sector. That being said, Jack, I believe you also attended the press conference that Andres was at, and then you attended another one by the government back on last Friday, I believe. Could you briefly tell us about that as well?
The Health Ministry talking about the reforms that they're laying out, and also on the defensive, pointing out that these are not just in response to what's going on at the moment, but these are reforms they have been trying to push through for months to try and deal with what is systemic problems in the healthcare system. Andres was just talking about the low fees doctors receive because they're capped, which is why we see obstetrics, pediatricians being paid so little, and yet in other services like skin care, plastic surgery, doctors making a lot more money, and why the hospitals are struggling. At that press conference, the doctors said in, say, Tokyo General Hospital or the Mayo Clinic, there are about 10% of resident doctors, whereas in South Korea, it's about 40%. So they deal with that low income gap by bringing in cheap labor, essentially, which is resident doctors, and that's why the whole system is straining. So at that reform meeting, they were saying we are trying to raise those basic fees. So in the areas of medical service in Seoul, but also in the rural areas, doctors can make more money, and the government will step in to try and get a fund to subsidize some of that so that it isn't immediately passed on to those seeking the services. But also something else Andreas touched on. South Korea, to my mind, is one of the only countries where if there is malpractice, you go through the criminal court. So a doctor might end up with a manslaughter charge and in jail. This is something, certainly in Australia, this would never happen. You can get sued. You might end up having to pay out money, but you're not going to end up jail and a criminal with a criminal record. So the government's trying to change this and a lot of other things. And this is the way. The doctors are right. There are systemic problems. But I would say the government is also right. It needs to change, and you need more doctors. That is definitely part of the solution. So, you know, as you mentioned, talks are ongoing. Hopefully they get traction, because as we see today, professors now threatening to step in and resign en masse across the country, which would only make the current situation worse.
Right. And in the meantime, a very brief question, Jack, to you. You're a father of a beautiful baby boy. What can you tell us about your experience with at the local pediatric clinic, for example?
I think my wife sums it up the best when she compares going to the local pediatric clinic to attending a rock concert with a popular artist. You've got a brief minute in the morning to try and get in and get your place, and it's like can't get through. And when you do, in that minute, you find out you're sort of in the last half an hour at the end of the day, and then you get down to the clinic and it's like a kindergarten but full of sick children. So you know, there's a doctor in there obviously getting children through as quickly as possible. The whole feeling is of being overwhelmed. And of course, this is a kindergarten full of sick children. So I often feel like you take your child in for one thing and you come out with something else that you picked up in the extended long wait in the waiting room with everybody. So yeah, it's very easy. If you go down and you have a child and you go to the clinic, you can see that the system is failing. And clearly there needs to be big changes. If we're optimistic, we can hope that one positive thing that will come out of this crisis is the kind of change so that in 1 year's time, we can hopefully get the care down at the pediatrician, that getting at some of the, like a skin care specialist or something at the moment.
Hopefully we'll keep our fingers crossed for that moving forward. Then Andres, on the security front, as you pointed out last week, you forecast this. North Korea has responded very angrily to the joint drills by South Korea and the US. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, the U.S. and South Korea started conducting their yearly springtime military drills, big scale, the Freedom Shield exercises, and eventually North Korea responded. North Korea normally considers these exercises as a rehearsal to invade its territory. So what North Korea did was, first Kim Jong-un actually visited a training operational base, it was called, on the western coast of North Korea. And there he told people assembled in front of him that, you know, drills had to be, let's say, improved or intensified. And then what he did the next day was actually in the same area. KCNA said he directed or managed artillery drills. We're talking about live fire artillery drills. There was all these artillery pieces on a beachfront, firing in a synchronized way. Of course, it's North Korea. It's all about the visuals, etc. But most importantly, with what Kim Jong-un said was, like, in these drills, some of the units involved were these units that have, he said, the enemy's capital within their range, kind of pointing towards Seoul. Well, you know, it's known that apparently North Korea has, especially in the area, this mountainous area behind Kaesong City, not far from where that industrial complex, inter-Korean industrial complex is, many artillery pieces, allegedly with capacity to strike, definitely the Seoul metropolitan area, and some people say even the city center, which we don't know if it's true or not. South Korea responded on the same day, and it did what is called an elephant walk, which is basically you taxi your military aircraft in a display of power. In this case, the South Korean Air Force, for the first time in history, basically taxied every single model of its fighter jets that it has operational. That's F-4s, F-5s, F-14s, F-15s, F-16s, and F-35, which is the jet fighter that North Korea hates the most, of course, because it's the most advanced. The Air Force actually pointed out that the F-5s, which are on the very light range of these fighter aircrafts, are supposed to be part of the quick response team in charge of defending the Seoul metropolitan area and, of course, targeting potential artillery attacks. So, once again, you know, exchanges on both sides, no talks in sight, that's for sure. Right. That's for sure.
Very strong shows of strength then by South Korea as well. Jack, despite these threats though, North Korea has yet to conduct a missile test in recent times. That being said, I'm going to borrow an idiomatic expression. Are we looking at a classic scenario of some calm before the storm?
I think there's always calm before the storm when it comes with North Korea. We just have to ask how long. But the nature of Pyongyang's weapons tests have changed over the past year. So in the a year or 2 years ago, we used to wonder, is this a political test? Is it sending a symbol? But what we've seen recently is a series of genuine tests, most recently being cruise missiles. So they'll tend to test one type of weapon for weeks until they know they've got it right. And before that, it was solid fuel submarine launch missiles and medium range missiles. And there really is genuine testing going on. Building up this capacity, as Kim Jong-un has been saying, but you also have to wonder, is it also for sales to Russia? It's like saying, here we go, we've got this one, because this is clearly a big revenue earner for North Korea at the moment. So it's a different kind of scenario, but at the same time, you know, there could be a nuclear test down the road. There's definitely something more coming. I thought it was very interesting the other day at the 2 sessions in China, Wang Yi suddenly stepping in and saying we need a pause in weapons tests from Pyongyang in return for an end to military exercises. And this seemed to be, you know, coming at this time of a pause in tests in Pyongyang. What's going on? And you have to wonder with Beijing, because obviously they don't want to come out against the DPRK. But the more the DPRK rattles the saber, the more strategic US assets come into the region. That's not in China's interest. Another nuclear test would not be in China's interest. And so while having to on the face of it saying we're defending the DPRK's actions, you have to wonder if behind the scenes Beijing isn't trying to actively curb some of this activity, which clearly they don't like because it leads to a bigger US presence exactly where they don't want it.
All right, and speaking of all this, Andres, in its latest annual risk assessment report, U.S. intelligence authorities have said that North Korea remains very strongly committed to its nuclear weapons ambitions. That being said, now South Korea and the U.S. prior to this had spoken about very strong measures in the event of another nuclear test by North Korea, which hasn't taken place in quite a while now. What measures do you envision?
Well, Jack actually just mentioned the measures that come to mind, which is basically a larger deployment of U.S. strategic assets. Last year we were seeing all this testing. We saw airplane carriers coming to Korea. We saw the first SSBN, the first nuclear-powered and ballistic missile-equipped U.S. submarine coming to Korea. We would probably see a lot of that and on very frequent intervals. But I think the point here, as Jack said, it's interesting. I think right now, if it's trying to do this for political reasons, another nuclear test, the cost for the DPRK could be interesting in this case, because I think that in this case, both China and Russia would go back to the Security Council and say, like, we're back to sanctions. We're back to sanctioning the DPRK. There's no instance of any nuclear power being happy with a smaller country testing nuclear weapons in history. That's for sure. And as you pointed out very clearly, China would not be happy at all with this, and not even Russia, its big ally these days. So let's see. I mean, satellite imaging has been pointing out that since early 2022, North Korea is ready to conduct another nuclear test in Punggye-ri, and it hasn't done so. The only operational reason that I could think in the nature that we've been seeing these late tests, which are really operational, they're actually trying to test how these weapon systems work, would be, for example, if they try to detonate a strategic nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon. That is one that can't be used in a proximity theater, and this means South Korea, unfortunately, because all the weapon systems and that warhead, that nuclear warhead that it presented last year is technically supposed to be a tactical nuclear weapon. Let's see what happens. But for now, I don't think the DPRK is very interested in conducting another nuclear test, to be honest.
Right. Hopefully you're right then. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, Jack, in light of International Women's Day, which fell last Friday, I spoke with a scholar here who spoke about the importance of taking the dispute over the plight of comfort women between Seoul and Tokyo onto the table of human rights activists instead of leaving it as a political football to be hit around by diplomats of the two governments. What are your thoughts regarding this?
I think it has to be both. Obviously, there's no way of escaping that this is a political action and will need to be dealt with between governments. But at the same time, you know, these are human beings, and there are still surviving women. There's only about half a dozen left alive. And they're still living with what they went through. And, you know, we have to remember the humanity of these people. And there has to be action taken in a way to show them that we haven't forgotten, that society hasn't forgotten, and that you know, people are still striving for a correct action. At the same time, I do understand a bit from Japan's side that it said in 1965 it did settle all this issue. It did. It paid a large amount of money, and it with an acknowledgement, and the aim of that payment was for it to go to victims. It was South Korea that decided to instead put it into building what is today the Miracle on the Han River. You could say maybe that was a wise investment, but it did cut out the victims, and that wasn't what Japan had intended. And so in Japan's mind, it did pay the money for compensation. It's just it didn't actually turn out to go as compensation. And then in 2015, we had the other agreement. So, you know, we have had apologies. Maybe they're not as heartfelt as they should have been. And unfortunately, we keep having these revisions. So you'll have an apology, and then another administration comes in and goes, oh, well, it wasn't, they volunteered. And then we have another apology and another revision. And so it's this mess. So I don't see any way out of this. It will stay in the political arena, and it will stay in the human rights arena. And hopefully at some point, and I know it's a little controversial, but the comfort women after 1945 who serviced US troops up into the 70s, and unfortunately they're right in the shadows and keep getting brushed under the table with, you know, successive governments using Japan's excuse that they weren't forced. They say they were forced, and not getting any sort of time in the spotlight at all. So the whole thing, unfortunately, is just very tragic, with elements still to be examined today, I think.
All right, remains to be an issue that needs some closure, of course, for the victims then. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this session. Jack, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Andres, thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks, Sunny, as always.
Right, well, on that note, we end this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.